They say the Emperor gives life, but I was born choking on mine. My first memory is the taste of ash. Not the soft, cold kind that drifts from burnt paper or wood, but the kind that bites, the kind that scrapes against the teeth like ground glass and settles behind the tongue as if it belongs there. The world I came from had no clean air, no mercy, no softness to it. Even the winds were edged, their breath hot with chemicals and the stench of something long dead and still dying. The skies were never blue. They were the color of rusted metal, bruised by storms that carried nothing but grit and sorrow. My mother told me once, in a whisper meant for no one to hear, that the ground trembled the moment I first screamed. I like to think the planet noticed me then, as if it were deciding whether to kill me quickly or let me rot slowly in its poisoned breath. The settlement where I was born, if it could be called that, was a collection of skeletal habs raised on metal stilts above the ground that fumed and smoked like a beast's back. The earth was cracked open in veins of black glass and sulfuric mud. Sometimes it spat fire, sometimes it only breathed poison. They called our home times Habstilt 9 *, not out of pride, but practicality. There had been 12 before us, 3 still stood. The others sank into the soil, their people swallowed in their sleep. No one mourned. There was no time for grief where I was born. Survival was not celebrated, it was expected. And those who failed to meet expectation were simply gone, as if they had never been. When I was born, my mother wrapped me in a rebreather cloak, tattered, crusted with the dust of 100 storms, and pressed her cracked lips to my forehead. I remember the faint smell of oxidized metal and sweat. I remember the murmured cadence of her prayer. The words were not her own. They were the same dead syllables repeated for generations, inherited like a disease. By breath, we endure. By pain, we prove. By survival, we serve. That was our gospel, not of love or light, but of endurance. The Emperor was distant, unreachable. We had no shrines, no temples, only the superstition that he might notice us if we refused to die. I grew up among the hum of filtration engines and the endless sigh of corrosion. The air recyclers groaned like old beasts, their vents coughing out clouds of half-cleaned atmosphere that smelled of oil and blood. When they broke, and they always did, people suffocated quietly in their habs, faces blackened, lungs hardened to stone. We learned early that silence was holy, screaming only wasted breath. The elders said the world had once been green. They said oceans had once reflected the sun, and the ground had given food freely. We thought them liars. No one believed in such weakness. Life, as we knew it, was a constant theft from the planet's hunger. You had to take your breath by force. You had to earn your next sunrise with wounds. The first thing I ever killed was the sky. Or at least, that's how it felt. I was 6 years old when I climbed to the top of the settlement's outer gantries to clear a blockage in the air vents. The clouds above were low and red, pulsing with electric veins. When the storm came, it was like the sky exhaled in anger. The first gust threw grit into my eyes, blinding me. The second gust tore a panel from its bolts and sent it spinning into the void. I remember standing there, clutching the rusted railing, watching as the lightning struck the ground far below. The earth didn't resist it, split open and screamed flame. For a moment, I thought the planet was alive. No, not alive times awake *, and I had disturbed it. When the wind died, the silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of something waiting. I spat black phlegm into the storm drain and muttered the prayer my mother had taught me. My lips bled where the dust had cut them. The air burned my throat, and yet I breathed. I always breathed. That night, when I returned to the lower habs, the elders gathered around the heating coils to speak of omens. They said the storm had taken one of the outer stilts times Habstilt 10 *, a kilometer east, and dragged it into the ground. Dozens dead, maybe more. The ground had eaten them whole. The elders didn't weep. They just nodded, murmuring their thanks that it wasn't us this time. My mother stared into the glow of the heater, her eyes reflecting the dull red light. "Someday," she whispered to me, "the ground will take us too. It takes everything in the end, even the faithful." I didn't understand then what she meant by times faithful. I thought it meant those who prayed hardest. Later I learned it meant those who endured longest. We lived in fear of the ground, but we needed it. It gave us the minerals our recyclers needed. It was the only place we could scavenge for metal or bone. Every week, the elders sent work teams down on cable lifts, thin threads dangling into the glowing fog. The lifts creaked under the weight of the miners, and when they returned, sometimes fewer came back than went down. The ones who returned had eyes that did not blink, and skin that smoked where the acid dust had kissed it. They never spoke about what they saw below. I was 8 when I saw a man dissolve. He was one of the scavengers who had brought back a load of metal scrap, dragging it up the lift while shouting praise to the Emperor. The crowd gathered to help unload, but when he stumbled forward, we saw the black vapor leaking from his suit. The seal had broken. The poison had crept in. He fell to his knees, clutching his throat, foam bubbling from between his teeth. His skin turned the color of burned parchment, cracking and peeling away. No one helped. We couldn't. To touch him was death. My mother held me back, her hand gripping my shoulder so hard I thought she'd break it. "Watch," she hissed. "And remember." I did. I remembered everything, the sound of him choking, the way his body thrashed against the metal floor, the stink of his flesh as it melted. When the body stopped moving, one of the elders stepped forward and drew the sign of the Aquila in the air. "His breath has returned to the Emperor," she said. I wondered then, if the air itself kills us, what kind of God demands we keep breathing it? As I grew older, I learned that death was not an event, it was a presence. It lived among us. It watched from every vent and shadow, from the clouds that rolled like bruises overhead. The poison storms came without warning, roaring across the horizon in waves of grit and acid rain. The sound of them was like teeth grinding bone. When the alarms wailed, we sealed the hatches and prayed the filters would hold. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Once, the storm breached through the lower hatches. The gas flooded the corridors like a ghost. We could hear it hissing, whispering, moving as if alive. I remember pressing my face against my mother's side as the air thickened with smoke. The lights dimmed, flickering red. All around, people coughed and screamed. My lungs felt like fire. And yet, somehow, the rebreather cloaks held. We survived. A dozen others did not. Afterward, the dead were stacked outside, their bodies still steaming where the poison had eaten through their flesh. The overseers didn't bury them. They burned them on pyres of scrap, letting the smoke drift into the poisoned air like an offering. That was our funeral rite. Return the dead to the breath that killed them. When I was 10, the elders began the breathing trials. Every child had to undergo them before being declared times fit for service *. The service wasn't military. Not yet, it was survival itself. They would take us out onto the surface, away from the stilts, and make us stand in the open air. The horizon burned with chemical light. The air tasted like rust and old blood. We were given one rebreather each, old and unreliable. The test was simple. Survive until dawn. Half of us didn't. The others came back changed. Their eyes were harder. Their skin cracked and darkened. Some coughed blood for days afterward. A few never spoke again. I remember my turn, the long, lonely night, beneath a sky that shimmered with toxin storms. I stood beside a rusted husk of some ancient machine, its metal bones jutting from the ground like the ribs of a god. My rebreather wheezed with each breath, its filters clogged with dust. At some point, I thought I heard voices whispering in the wind, old prayers, maybe, or just the air playing tricks on my starving mind. When dawn came, the light was the same color as rot. I removed my mask and breathed the air raw. Just once. It burned like fire and iron, but I did not fall. The elders called me times blessed *. I felt nothing but empty. Years passed. The storms grew worse. The ground shook more often. The stilts began to buckle under the strain. Each tremor sent fear crawling up our spines. Some said the planet itself wanted us gone, that we were parasites clinging to a dying host. Others said the Emperor had placed us here to prove our worth. I wasn't sure which was worse. By the time I turned 16, I had stopped praying. My mother still whispered her litanies every night, her voice thin and cracked from years of filtered air. One evening, as we watched another storm swallow the horizon, she turned to me and said, "You must learn to see mercy in the poison." I laughed quietly, bitterly. "There's no mercy here." She looked at me for a long time, her eyes pale and glassy. "You're wrong. Mercy is waking up and still breathing." That night, she didn't wake up. The storm had claimed her in her sleep, the filters failing one last time. I found her stiff and silent, her face serene behind the mask. The air was still thick with dust, but I stayed there for hours, sitting beside her, breathing the same poisoned air, waiting for the same mercy to take me. It didn't. It never does. Death avoids those who long for it. We burned her body at dawn. The smoke rose black against the red sky, carrying with it the last of her breath. The elders said she was with the Emperor now. I didn't believe them. The Emperor had never come here. If he had, he would have died like the rest of us. After that, I stopped fearing the air. It had already taken everything from me. What more could it do? I walked the gantries alone, the metal creaking beneath my boots, and looked out across the wasteland. The storms were gathering again, churning in the distance. I could see the bones of old Habs jutting from the earth, remnants of those who had lived and died before us. Their ghosts were in the dust. Their breath was in my lungs. The world was an inheritance of death, and I was its heir. That's what it was like to be born there, to be born in defiance of the air itself, to breathe poison and call it life, to see the sky not as freedom, but as the first enemy you ever knew. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still taste it, the ash, the metal, the slow suffocation of every living thing. I breathe in, and it all comes back. The sound of the engines, the tremble of the stilts, the whisper of a prayer that never reached the heavens. Asterisk. By breath, we endure. By pain, we prove. By survival, we serve. Asterisk. I survived. That was my sin. We were not taught to live. We were taught to endure. Pain was the first tutor I ever knew, and it was patient. It waited in every shadow, in every breath of our world's poisoned wind, whispering that the only way to survive was to let it carve you hollow until nothing remained to hurt. Childhood, if it could be called that, was not measured in years or laughter, it was measured in scars. The elders began our education early. "You cannot be afraid of pain," they said, "because fear wastes breath." That was the first lesson. Fear was a luxury, like clean air or softness. We could not afford it. The world was already cruel enough without the burden of emotion. Our school was a collapsed manufactorum shell near the lower stilts, its walls flayed open by the storms, its metal skeleton pitted and black. The floor was a lattice of rusted mesh and holes that glowed faintly from the chemical seep below. We gathered there in groups of a dozen, wrapped in rags that once might have been uniforms, our eyes watering from the constant sting of the air. The overseer, a man known only as Old Car, stood before us with a shock rod in one hand and a tattered catechism in the other. He smelled of oil and infection. "Pain," he rasped through a damaged rebreather, "is the Emperor's proof that you still live. It is his reminder that you have not yet earned your rest." We repeated the words after him, choking on our own voices. He would walk between us, dragging the tip of the rod against the metal floor, letting the sparks leap and bite. Anyone who hesitated in the recitation felt the rod kiss their flesh. Not out of anger, just procedure. Pain was not punishment, it was instruction. By the end of the first month, none of us hesitated. We learned to crawl before we learned to walk, not as infants, but as children forced to move through the narrow crawl ducts that wound beneath the hab levels. The ducts were filled with dust, fungus, and the faint thrum of ancient machinery. It was our duty to clean them, to scrape away the buildup that choked the air filters. The ducts were narrow enough that the metal pressed against our backs and chests, and the noise of the fans roared like a heartbeat all around. If you panicked, you suffocated. If you stopped, you died. I remember the taste of the metal on my tongue, the way the air grew thin the deeper I crawled. Sometimes, when the filters shut down, the ducts would fill with fumes. We would crawl faster, our lungs burning, our eyes streaming with tears we couldn't wipe away. It was a kind of prayer in motion, every movement a plea to keep breathing. Those who didn't make it back were left in the ducts. No one retrieved the bodies. The elders said it was better that way, their flesh would purify the air. I believed them for a long time. It made the smell easier to bear. When we weren't in the ducts, we were in the wastes beyond the stilts, scavenging for food or scrap. The surface was a graveyard of metal and bone, where the bones of titanic machines jutted from the dirt like the ribs of forgotten gods. The soil shimmered with toxins, and the wind howled with the voice of a dying world. We moved in groups of 3 or 4, our faces hidden behind masks too large for our heads. The beasts that lived out there were not animals as men knew them. They were the world's nightmares made flesh-mutated things, with translucent skin and eyes like molten glass. They lived off the fumes and the corpses. We learned to avoid them, but sometimes avoidance failed. The first time I saw one up close, I was 9. We had been sent to retrieve a crate that had fallen from one of the supply lifts, food rations, the elders said. Precious, sacred. We found the crate half buried in the dust, split open, its contents steaming with rot. I was reaching for a sealed pack when the ground shifted beneath us. At first, I thought it was another tremor. Then the dirt split open, and something pale erupted from the earth. It had too many limbs and no eyes. Its body glistened like wet leather, and its mouth, if it could be called that, was a ring of teeth that clicked like metal gears. It moved faster than thought. One of the others, a boy named Jer, screamed as it wrapped around him. The sound of the bones breaking still haunts me. We ran. We didn't look back. When we returned to the Habs, Old Carr beat us for abandoning the mission. He called it cowardice. If the Emperor wanted you alive, he said, he would have given you claws. That night, I dreamed of Jer's face, the way it had vanished into the creature's maw. I woke up screaming, but no one comforted me. Comfort was another thing we could not afford. The next morning, they sent us back. The creature was gone, but Jer's remains were not. We found what was left of him: a hand, a strip of cloth, and the half-crushed rebreather mask. I buried them in the dust. I didn't pray. I didn't know how anymore. Every day after that, I felt something inside me shifting. The fear didn't go away. It simply became part of me, a familiar ache like hunger or breath. We were told to honor pain, to learn from it, but in truth, it wasn't reverence I felt. It was numbness. The lessons weren't shaping us. They were erasing us. Even the air seemed to take joy in the process. The elders used to tell stories of saints who had endured worse, men who walked through fire or were flayed alive in the Emperor's name. They spoke of their faith as if it were armor. But faith doesn't stop hunger, or acid, or teeth. What it does is keep you from realizing how empty you've become. By the time I was 12, I had forgotten the sound of laughter. Not just the sound, the concept. It didn't exist in our vocabulary. Joy was weakness, and weakness was death. The only songs we knew were work chants, the kind that matched the rhythm of pickaxes and hammers. Our lullabies were the hum of engines, the wheeze of broken respirators, the slow drip of condensation in the hab pipes. Sometimes, when the storms grew too thick, the elders made us stay inside for days. The air would turn yellow, the world beyond the hatches lost in haze. We could hear the beasts moving outside, slow, dragging sounds like wet leather sliding over stone. The walls shook, and dust fell from the ceiling in tiny clouds. The elders said they were testing us, that the Emperor sent them as trials. But we knew better. They weren't divine. They were the planet's children, born of its hatred for us. On one of those long nights, I met a girl named Lyra. She was older than me by a few years, her hair bleached white by the toxins, her eyes sharp and unflinching. We shared a water ration once, sitting in the dark near the heating coils. She told me she'd seen the world beyond the horizon, where the storms were so thick that the air itself glowed green. "Do you think there's anything out there?" I asked her. "Nothing that wants us alive," she said, and smiled, a thin, cracked thing that wasn't really a smile at all. I think I loved her, in the way that someone drowning loves the hand that doesn't push them under. A week later, she vanished. The elders said she had gone scavenging alone and never returned. Some whispered that the ground had taken her, like it took the others. I liked to think she'd walked away, out into the wastes, and kept walking until even the poison gave up on killing her. That thought gave me strength for a while, but strength, like air, never lasts long on a world like ours. One morning, the ground split open beneath Habstilt 9. The quake tore through the supports, sending a section of the outer platforms crashing into the fog below. I was among the workers assigned to salvage what we could. We climbed down the twisted metal, coughing through the smoke, the heat searing our boots. The wreckage was alive with small fires and the hiss of boiling chemicals. We found bodies fused to the girders, some still twitching, their limbs half dissolved. I remember the smell, a mixture of oil, blood, and burnt copper. The elders ordered us to cut the metal free, to retrieve the sacred materials. The bodies were irrelevant. The Emperor reclaims what he wills, they said. I didn't feel horror. Not anymore. Just a kind of dull reverence for the efficiency of death. That was the true lesson of pain. Not endurance, not strength, but obedience. To the world, to the elders, to the Emperor, who never spoke, but whose silence demanded everything. Pain taught us that rebellion was pointless, that mercy was weakness, and that survival was its own punishment. Each day survived was proof that we could endure more. Each scar was a promise that tomorrow would be worse. I still have them across my hands, my chest, my throat. Lines of memory carved into flesh. Each one a story, a scripture, a reminder that the body learns faster than the soul. And yet, sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the storms were quiet and the air recyclers hummed like distant waves, I would imagine another kind of world, one where the sky didn't burn, where the ground didn't tremble, where pain wasn't the only teacher worth listening to. But those thoughts were dangerous. They led to hope, and hope was a heresy punishable by exile. I buried those thoughts deep, where even the poison couldn't reach them. In time, I forgot what it meant to be a child. Childhood was a luxury we couldn't afford. We were not raised, we were tempered, hammered, shaped into something the Imperium could use. The elders said our suffering made us strong. They were wrong. It made us useful. When I think back now, I realize that we weren't being prepared to live, we were being prepared to die well. Every lesson, every scar, every whispered prayer was meant to teach us one truth, that our bodies did not belong to us. They were offerings, tools, fuel. And we learned that lesson well. Excellent. We now descend into ***. Chapter 3. ***The Beasts Below. Adolescence. In a world that wants its children devoured. This chapter will be a full-length, first-person confession of roughly 2,000 words or more, steeped in dread and intimacy. The ground itself alive and hungry, the human voice becoming a whisper between tremors. ***. Chapter 3. The Beasts Below. ***. By the time I reached adolescence, the ground itself had learned my name. It whispered it back to me through the soles of my feet when I walked across the rusted gantries. The vibrations, subtle but intimate, like something vast and unseen stirring beneath the surface, curious about the small thing daring to move above it. The elders used to say that our world was hollow, that a vast network of tunnels and chambers ran beneath the poisoned crust. Some claimed the tunnels were remnants of an ancient civilization that had mined too deep. Others said the planet had always been alive, that it simply dreamed beneath its own skin, dreaming of our extinction. I didn't believe them. Not until the ground began to move. The tremors had started months earlier, small ones at first, barely enough to rattle the filtration ducts. But as the days passed, they grew stronger. Entire sections of the settlement began to sag, the stilts groaning under stress. One night, we heard a sound unlike any other, a deep, echoing moan that rolled through the air like thunder. The metal beneath our feet trembled, and the elders ordered everyone to seal their habs and pray. We prayed for 3 days. The sound didn't stop. When the vibrations finally subsided, we emerged to find that the ground beneath Habstilt 11 had split open completely. A sinkhole 100 meters across had devoured it whole. There was no wreckage, no survivors, just a gaping wound in the earth, exhaling a slow, poisonous mist. The elders declared the sight forbidden. They called it times the more asterisk. But the children, myself among them, could not resist. We crept to its edge at night, watching the fog shift and pulse like a living thing. Sometimes, in the depths of that chasm, we saw movement shapes too large to be imagined, gliding just below the surface haze. We would throw stones into the darkness and listen for the echo. Sometimes there was none. Sometimes there was a sound like time's breathing. Asterisk. The first to die was a boy named Sarek. He was older than me, proud, reckless. One night he leaned too far over the edge to prove his courage. The fog surged upward, a sudden exhalation, and something caught him, something that moved too quickly to see. He didn't scream, the air itself swallowed the sound. When the mist settled, he was gone. The only thing left was his rebreather, its tubing still twitching as if it were alive. We stopped going to the moor after that. But the ground didn't stop coming for us. Within weeks, the tremors spread. Entire sections of the lower stilts collapsed, dragging the habs into the soil. The noise of tearing metal became a nightly hymn. We learned to sleep lightly, our rebreathers strapped tight, our weapons within reach. The elders said the planet was testing our faith. I began to think it was feeding. One evening, while clearing debris from a collapsed walkway, I felt the vibration beneath me, a subtle hum, rhythmic, like the pulse of a buried heart. I crouched and pressed my hand to the metal. The vibration wasn't mechanical, it was times alive. Asterisk. I felt it through my bones, felt it moving up through the stilts and into my body like a whisper saying, asterisk, you do not belong here. Asterisk. I froze. Then the ground broke open. It happened fast. The earth beneath the walkway split, the metal twisting and snapping like brittle bone. A cloud of ash erupted upward, and from it came a sound that was not a roar but something far worse. A low, wet times exhalation, asterisk as if the world itself had sighed in hunger. I ran, stumbling as the structure fell away behind me, the fog swallowing everything. By dawn, a dozen were missing. The survivors gathered in silence as the overseers took count. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and rot. I remember staring at the hole where the walkway had been, the edges slick with some kind of mucus sheen. The elders dipped their fingers into it and whispered prayers. One of them, an old woman with a voice like cracked metal, declared it holy secretion. I wanted to scream that it wasn't holy, it was a time's warning. Asterisk. But no one would have listened. The days that followed blurred into a ritual of relocation. We abandoned the lower levels entirely, moving higher up the stilts, building new walkways on the backs of the old. But the ground's reach grew longer. It began to send tendrils, roots, limbs, or perhaps things that only times looked times like them up through the cracks. We found them coiled around the supports, pulsing faintly as if they breathed. The overseers ordered them burned. They screamed when the fire touched them, not loud, but enough to make the metal hum with the echo. That was when we started whispering about times the beasts below. Asterisk. No one knew what they were. Some said they were remnants of an ancient mining fauna bred by forgotten industries to dig and devour. Others claimed they were the planet's immune system reacting to our infestation. The priests, of course, said they were demons sent to test our devotion. But I began to wonder if the world even needed demons. It was already hell. Work continued despite the danger. The Imperium demanded its tithe ore, metals, anything the surface could yield. We were expendable, and the overseers reminded us of that daily. Your suffering is your offering, they would say, and your death, if it comes, is your proof of loyalty. It became harder and harder to tell whether the creatures beneath the ground or the men above it were worse. I remember the night the beasts finally came for us. It started with a vibration so deep it made the air ripple. The metal stilts groaned, and dust rained from the ceiling. We thought it was another quake, and the overseers barked the usual orders: brace, seal, pray. But then came the time's sound. Asterisk. A scream, low and endless, like steel being torn apart under water. The sound rose through the stilts, and the metal began to melt. Not from heat from friction, Something was climbing. We ran to the outer platforms, but the fog had already risen around us, glowing faintly with chemical light. Through it, we saw shapes massive, undulating, dragging themselves upward with limbs that were not limbs at all. The first one breached the surface beneath the hab core, a tower of flesh and chitin, its hide shimmering with oil and bone. Its mouth was a vertical wound, opening and closing with mechanical precision. The air itself seemed to recoil from it. Lasfire erupted. The overseers, the guards, everyone who could hold a weapon fired into the fog. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the horror for heartbeats at a time enough to see that there were times, many times of them. The ground writhed like a living ocean. The creatures tore through metal like parchment. The stilts snapped one by one, the screams of collapsing steel mixing with the human ones. I remember seeing a man lifted into the air, his body impaled on a jagged spine, then swallowed whole. Another was crushed beneath falling debris, his blood hissing where it touched the metal. I ran. Not out of bravery, not even out of fear, just instinct. The survival reflex that had been beaten into us since birth. I ran across a shaking walkway, the fog swirling around me, the air alive with the stench of blood and ozone. Behind me, I heard the beasts tearing through the habs, their movements accompanied by a chorus of grinding and wet snapping sounds. I made it to the upper platforms, where the last of the survivors gathered around the emergency beacon, a crude transmitter meant to signal passing Imperial ships. The overseer, his face streaked with soot, screamed into the vox for evacuation, for aid, for times anything, asterisk. The response was static. The Imperium didn't hear us. Or worse, it did, and decided we weren't worth saving. When dawn came, the fog began to recede. The beasts, if that's what they were, sank back into the earth, leaving only ruin behind. Half the settlement was gone, swallowed by the ground. The remaining stilts leaned at odd angles, their shadows stretching across the wasteland like the bones of a dying animal. In the aftermath, the survivors gathered to decide what to do. The elders said we must rebuild. I remember laughing when I heard it, a dry, broken laugh that startled even me. Rebuild? On times what asterisk? The ground itself had declared war on us. There was nowhere left to stand, but we obeyed anyway. We always did. As we rebuilt, I learned to move in silence. The beasts could sense vibration, the elders said. The slightest sound might draw them. So we learned to whisper, to step lightly, to breathe shallowly. I carried a blade made from scavenged metal, sharp and cold, and slept with it against my chest. I dreamed of the ground shifting beneath me, of tendrils wrapping around my legs, of being dragged into the soil, my breath replaced by earth. Months passed, but the tremors never stopped. They became part of the rhythm of life, the pulse of our doomed existence. We would wake to the groaning of the stilts, eat in silence, and sleep to the sound of the ground murmuring beneath us. And yet, in that endless dread, something changed in me. Fear no longer ruled me. It became me. It was not an emotion anymore, but a sense, like hearing or smell. I could times feel, times the earth's hunger, its slow, patient hatred. It didn't want us gone quickly. It wanted us to linger, to suffer, to know we were trespassers. I used to think of my mother's words, asterisk, mercy is waking up and still breathing, asterisk. But I began to wonder if mercy might have been in the swallowing. One night, as I stood watch over the upper gantries, I looked down at the landscape, a sea of fog, shifting and pulsing with faint light. For the first time, I thought I saw shapes moving not beneath it, but above it, winged things, thin and elongated, gliding silently. Their bodies glimmered like mercury in the toxic haze. I blinked, and they were gone. Maybe they had always been there. Maybe the beasts below were only half the truth. That was the last night I saw Hab Stilt 9 standing whole. By dawn, the tremors began again, stronger, faster. The air filled with the smell of burning oil and ozone. The supports cracked. Screams echoed through the metal. I watched the central column bend, the sky rippling with heat. The overseers ordered evacuation, but there was nowhere to go. The beasts were awake again, and this time, they would not stop until the last of us was gone. When the ground opened, I did not run. I stood at the edge and looked down into the chasm, into the endless red fog, and I thought, asterisk, so this is the face of our God. Asterisk, the earth, the beasts, the endless hunger, they were truer than the Emperor's silence. They had always been with us. They had never lied. And when the fog surged upward, when the air filled with the sound of gnashing and tearing, I closed my eyes and waited to be taken. But the ground spared me. It took everyone else. When the storm cleared, I was alone on a twisted section of platform, the rest of Habstilt 9 gone. Below me stretched nothing but a glowing crater, slowly pulsing like a dying heart. I breathed the poison, tasted the ash, and understood. Survival was not a blessing, it was a sentence. That was the day I stopped fearing the beasts below. Because I realized the truth. The beasts were not beneath the ground. They were inside us all along. Excellent. Now begins Chapter 4, the arrival of the Emperor's men, the first intrusion of the wider Imperium into the narrator's forsaken world. It is the moment of false salvation. Thunder in the skies, the taste of hope curdled by bureaucracy and the machinery of war. The style will remain confessional, intimate, and sensory, the voice of one who has survived too long to believe in rescue. When they came from the sky, we thought the world was ending again. We prayed for death, and instead, the Emperor answered with engines. It had been nearly a year since the beasts swallowed the last of Habstilt 9. I had wandered the wastes alone since then, half feral, half machine, kept alive by instinct and the stubborn cruelty that my world had bred into me. I scavenged among the bones of the old settlements, feeding on whatever the poison hadn't yet claimed. My body was lean and scarred. My skin had taken on the same grey tint as the ash I breathed. I no longer spoke aloud. There was no one left to listen. So when the sky burned, I thought it was just another storm until I heard the rhythm. Engines. Human. Controlled. The clouds split open in a wound of fire and thunder. Through it descended shapes of metal, sleek and unnatural, too perfect for this dying world. Dropships, though I didn't know the name, then screamed as they cut through the poison sky, their trails turning the clouds black. I fell to my knees and pressed my hands to my ears. The sound was unbearable, holy and violent at once, like the voice of a god shouting through a machine. They landed where the earth was still scarred from the fall of our settlement. The impact cracked the soil and sent waves of heat through the air. I watched from a ridge, half hidden by the fog, as ramps lowered and figures emerged, tall, armored men in masks that shone like glass. Their movements were precise, their weapons clean, their voices amplified through vox speakers that echoed across the valley. They spoke in high Gothic language that sounded more like ritual than speech. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. Authority, ownership, dominion. They moved with purpose, setting up perimeter lights and auspex scanners. Servitors' twisted flesh bound to steel crawled among them, their limbs clicking like insects. The soldiers' banners bore the sigil of the double-headed eagle, the mark of the Imperium. I had seen it only once before, carved into a rusted prayer plate in the Habs. The elders said it was the symbol of salvation. Salvation. The word felt foreign on my tongue, like trying to swallow a blade. I watched for hours as they worked, my mind torn between wonder and suspicion. These were not the beasts of my world. They were worse organized, unafraid, untouched by the poison that devoured everything else. They moved through the air as if it belonged to them. I wanted to hate them, but part of me was drawn to their certainty. They didn't flinch, they didn't pray, they times commanded. Asterisk. When night fell, the valley glowed with their lights cold and pure, unlike the red haze we called daylight. I crept closer, drawn by hunger and the faint scent of food. The soldiers had erected prefabricated habs and a command post. The air shimmered around them, filtered and sterilized by field generators. I could almost taste it. Asterisk. Clean air. Asterisk. My lungs ached with the memory of what that might feel like. I made it within 100 meters before they saw me. The first shot hit the ground near my feet, sending a burst of ash into my face. I dropped, coughing, blinded by dust. Voices barked through the darkness, commands in clipped syllables. A beam of light found me, bright as judgment. I raised my hands and tried to speak, but my throat was raw from years of poison. The words came out as a rasp. "Don't shoot," I croaked. "I'm alive." They surrounded me. Their armor gleamed even through the grime. One of them reached out, grabbed me by the arm, and dragged me toward the light. His grip was mechanical, augmented. I could hear the servos whining in his gauntlet. He said something into his vox, and within moments, another figure approached, taller, wearing a long coat of storm grey with an aquila etched across the chest. An officer. He removed his helmet. His face was human, but it didn't comfort me. Clean, pale, eyes sharp as cut glass. He studied me for a long moment, then spoke in a tone that was almost kind. "You're a survivor?" I nodded. The motion made my neck ache. "From which settlement?" "Habstilt 9, I managed to whisper. He glanced toward one of his aides, who tapped at a data slate. 9 was listed as lost 5 years ago, the aide said. The officer turned back to me, expression unreadable. "Impressive," he murmured. "You must be resilient." Resilient. That was their word for what we were. They said it often in the days that followed. They brought me into the camp, scrubbed the grime from my skin, forced me to drink water that tasted like nothing at all. The first sip burned my throat. Purity was painful after so much corruption. They examined me under bright lights, their Medicae officers muttering about toxins and cellular degradation. One even marveled that I could still breathe without assistance. They treated me like a specimen rather than a man. But they didn't kill me. That, in the Imperium, was mercy. Over the next days, more survivors emerged from the wastes, ragged, starving, blinded by the sudden brightness of the soldiers' lights. The Emperor's men gathered us in pens of chain link and plasticrete, feeding us nutrient paste and clean air. Some cried in gratitude. I did not. I watched the soldiers move among us, noting how they never removed their gloves, how their smiles never reached their eyes. They weren't here to save us. They were here to count times us. And soon enough, the counting began. Each morning, officers moved through the pens with data slates, scanning faces, taking notes. We heard them whisper about quotas and suitability. They spoke of flesh tithes and gene resilience. We were inventory, not refugees. When one of the younger men collapsed during inspection, they dragged his body away. No burial, no prayer, just subtraction. On the 4th day, a new group arrived, clerks and scribes in the grey robes of administratum. They carried stacks of parchment and servo quills, setting up a temporary office beside the landing zone. Their work was endless, recording names, assigning numbers, cataloguing our survival as though it were a sin. I remember one scribe asking my name. When I told him, he frowned. "Too long," he said, and wrote times subject 47 breath 9 times instead. That was the day I stopped being a man. When the selection began, the soldiers read the names or numbers aloud. Those chosen were led away toward the larger ships. The rest were left behind under the watch of servitors. No explanation, no promise. Just order. And order, in the Imperium, was gospel. I was chosen on the 7th day. A sergeant in flak armor handed me a stylus and a sheet of parchment. "Sign here," he said, his tone bored, as if I were agreeing to a trade rather than sealing my fate. The form bore the seal of the Astra Militarum, an eagle clutching a skull. I could barely read the text, but I recognized the words times Imperial service, asterisk. Beneath them, a line for my mark. I hesitated. What happens if I don't? The sergeant smiled, an ugly, tired thing. Then you'll feed the soil again, son. Either way, you serve. I pressed my thumb to the paper, leaving a smear of blood. A small price for escape, I told myself. But even then, I knew it was a lie. They stripped us of our rags, cut our hair, burned our belongings. The air was filled with the stench of disinfectant and ozone. We were herded onto transports like cattle, our names replaced by numbers, our identities erased by efficiency. As the ship's engines roared to life, I looked back through the porthole and saw my world shrinking into a smoldering dot, a wound that would never heal. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt betrayal, not by them, but by myself for believing that leaving meant freedom. The voyage off-world was a blur of sound and sickness. The ship was vast and sterile, every surface polished to inhuman perfection. The air was thin and cold, too clean to trust. The others, my kin, my fellow survivors, sat in silence, their faces pale under the harsh lights. We didn't speak. We didn't know how anymore. When gravity returned, the doors opened to reveal another world: gray skies, steel ground, and the endless geometry of barracks and watchtowers. The air smelled of oil and order. The sergeant who had taken my blood smiled again, gesturing to the horizon. "Welcome to service," he said. "Welcome to mercy." It was then I understood the truth that would haunt me forever. The Imperium did not rescue. It times harvested. Asterisk. We were not saved. We were times collected. Asterisk. And for the first time in my life, I envied the dead, the ones who had been swallowed by the ground, who never had to breathe this new kind of poison, the one made of discipline, prayer, and endless, bureaucratic obedience. We had survived our world only to be devoured by a greater one. Excellent. Now begins asterisk asterisk. Chapter 5. Asterisk. The cold mercy of discipline, where the narrator learns that the Imperium's mercy is only another form of torment. The prose will remain first person, intimate, oppressive, the confession of a body being broken not by hunger or beasts, but by order itself. They told us we had been chosen for glory. I learned, quickly, that glory is just another word for obedience. The training camps were not hell, not in the way I understood hell, anyway. Hell was the poison storms, the beasts beneath the soil, the long nights spent waiting for the ground to devour you. This was something different, cleaner, sharper. The Imperium's hell was engineered, measured, efficient. It didn't devour flesh, it times refined times it. We arrived at the camp before dawn. The air was cold and thin, the ground covered in frost that glittered like powdered bone. Rows of prefabricated habs stretched into the horizon, each identical, each numbered in neat black script. Floodlights swept the parade grounds, carving the dark into geometric slices. The smell of oil and ozone was everywhere. Our transport hissed open, and a voice barked through the vox. "Disembark. Form ranks. Eyes front." It wasn't a man's voice. It was a machine's, amplified, filtered, stripped of warmth. We stumbled out, blinking in the glare. Hundreds of us, survivors from a dozen death worlds, hive warrens, and mining moons. None of us looked human anymore. The toxins, radiation, and starvation had carved us down to something lean and feral. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Our fear was the same language. The drill masters were waiting. They wore long coats of black leather, each marked with the sigil of the Imperial Guard. Their eyes gleamed behind augmetic lenses. One of them, tall, grey-haired, with a voice like grinding gravel, stepped forward. His rank badge read times Sergeant Major FIL. Asterisk. I still remember the way his breath steamed in the cold air as he spoke. "You are not people," he said. "You are resources. You are what the Emperor demands when the galaxy forgets its place. You will become soldiers, or you will become fertilizer. There is no third option." He let the silence hang, heavy and deliberate. Then he smiled. "Welcome to mercy." The first week was a baptism of structure. We were taught to stand, walk, and breathe on command. Even our rest was scheduled. Sleep came in precise increments, 6 hours by the chrono, no more, no less. Meals were nutrient paste that tasted of ash, served in silence under the watchful gaze of servitors. Conversation was forbidden unless prompted. We were told that words bred weakness, that thought bred doubt, and that doubt was treason. The drills began on the second day. We ran until our feet bled, until our lungs burned with the same poison we'd carried from our birth worlds. We lifted weights made from broken machinery, crawled through mud that smelled of oil and chemical waste, and endured beatings for hesitation. The sergeants called it time's purification through structure. Asterisk. They said chaos lived in the muscles, and only pain could cleanse it. Pain. Always pain. But this was different from the pain of my homeworld. That pain was wild, impersonal. It came from nature's hatred. This pain was time's organized, asterisk. It had rank and uniform. It saluted before it struck. I remember one morning when the frost bit deep enough to freeze the tears in our eyes. We were lined up for inspection, bodies trembling in the cold. Sergeant Major Phil walked down the line, his boots crunching in the snow. He stopped in front of a boy who had coughed during formation. "Name?" Phil demanded. "Rin, sir," the boy stammered. Phil nodded once, almost kindly. Then he drew his sidearm and shot him in the knee. The sound was small. The silence that followed was enormous. "Pain," the sergeant said, holstering the pistol, "is a better teacher than mercy. Mercy makes you soft. The Emperor has no use for softness." The boy didn't scream for long. By dusk, he was gone, dragged away by Medicae servitors to some unseen disposal pit. The next day, the rest of us stood perfectly still, no matter how hard we shivered. That was how discipline took root, not in the mind, but in the nerves. You learned not to flinch, not to react, to anticipate punishment before it came, to move before thought, obey before comprehension. It became instinct, a reflex stronger than hunger. By the end of the first month, I could strip and reassemble a lasgun blindfolded. I could march for 30 kilometers without water. I could sleep standing upright, my mind empty but alert. And yet, for all that conditioning, I still felt something raw and unrefined beneath the surface. Resentment. Not against the sergeants, or the Emperor, but against myself, for still hoping that this was leading somewhere times better. Asterisk. Hope is the cruelest of all infections. The Imperium knows this. That's why they starve it first. The chaplains arrived in the second month, men in robes of crimson and black, their faces hidden behind iron masks shaped like skulls. They carried censers filled with incense that stank of burning oil. Their sermons echoed across the camp, hymns to purity, obedience, and the Emperor's endless grace. We were required to kneel during their prayers, even when our legs ached from drills. They spoke of sacrifice as salvation, of dying as the highest form of worship. I began to understand then. The Imperium didn't save lives. It times repurposed them. The chaplain who oversaw my unit was called Hierodiakon Malchus. His voice was deep and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. He would pace before us with a staff tipped with a miniature aquila, its wings smeared with dried blood. "Your body," he would say, "is the Emperor's weapon. Your soul is his ammunition. When you die, he will fire you into eternity." The others chanted the response automatically. "By pain we serve. By death we are sanctified." The words made my skin crawl. They were too close to the prayers of my home. The chaplains watched us closely for signs of time's doubt. Asterisk. Those who hesitated in prayer were dragged to the confessional barracks, a long, windowless structure at the edge of the compound. None who entered spoke of what happened inside. The only clue was the sound that carried through the walls, the slow rhythm of lashes and the murmur of recorded scripture. The next morning, those same men returned to the drills, with hollow eyes and perfectly synchronized steps. Whatever remained of their souls had been filed away like excess metal. One night, unable to sleep, I stood by the barracks window and watched the snow fall over the parade ground. The lights painted the flakes in shades of gray and white, like ash drifting from a distant fire. For a moment, it reminded me of home, the storms of dust that used to roll across the wastelands, the sky always red and bruised. Only here, the air was silent, controlled. Nothing screamed beneath the ground. The silence was almost worse. I realized then that the Imperium's cruelty wasn't loud. It was time's calm. Asterisk. The beasts of my world devoured you in a heartbeat. The Imperium took its time. Weeks blurred into months. The pain became routine, the obedience automatic. We stopped thinking of ourselves as individuals. The sergeants didn't need to shout anymore. We anticipated their commands before they gave them. When one of us faltered, the rest closed ranks to conceal the weakness. We were learning unity, they said. In truth, we were learning anonymity. There was a saying whispered among the veterans, asterisk, the Emperor's light is just another kind of fire. Asterisk, I believed it. During one particularly brutal drill, the instructors lined us up and made us recite the Imperial infantryman's prayer as we marched through a field of live fire. Bolts and last shots tore the air around us, cutting men down mid-verse. The chaplain walked beside us, chanting louder to drown out the screams. Through the darkness of the void, we march in his name. I remember the heat of the beam that passed inches from my cheek, the smell of ozone and blood mingling in the frozen air. We are his wrath made flesh, his mercy made flame. When it was over, half our unit lay smoking on the ground. The survivors knelt in silence as the medicae collected the dead. The chaplain raised his staff and declared, their faith was accepted. I wanted to laugh, but the muscles of my face had forgotten how. The next day, we repeated the drill. Fewer died that time. Progress. By the end of our training cycle, I no longer feared death. Not because I had conquered it, but because I had been hollowed of the part of me that recognized it. The fear of dying requires belief that something else might exist, that life, even in its agony, is preferable. But in the Imperium, lifetimes is time's agony. Everything beyond it is merely continuation. On the final night before deployment, we were assembled in the chapel, a long hall of steel and shadows. Candles burned in the shape of the aquila, their wax mixed with sacred oils that stank of incense and blood. The chaplain's voice echoed from the pulpit. You are ready, he said. You have been burned clean of weakness. The Emperor does not love you, he times uses times you, and to be used by him is the highest form of love. The room was silent. Then, as one, we responded, by pain we serve, by death we are sanctified. The words came easily now, smooth as oil. I think that frightened me more than anything else. After the benediction, I lay awake on my cot, staring at the ceiling. The lights flickered, casting shadows like the movement of wings. My bunkmate, a quiet man from some frozen mining moon, whispered beside me. Tomorrow, he said, we see a new world. His tone was not hopeful, it was resigned. I closed my eyes and imagined the beasts of my home, the rumbling earth, the whispering fog, the sense of being watched by something ancient and hungry. The Imperium was no different. It simply wore armor instead of flesh. Its hunger was the same, endless, disciplined, justified. We had escaped the jaws of our planet, only to crawl willingly into the mouth of the Emperor. That was the cold mercy of discipline. To be broken so completely that you mistake obedience for peace. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 6. Baptism by Lasfire. Asterisk, asterisk. They told us the world would be safer than our own. The Vox officer said it like a benediction as the transport thrummed around us, his voice washed thin by the machine's breath. A place of temperate air, open fields, and a sky that didn't rub your lungs raw. He listed the campaign's objectives the way a priest lists sins: cleanse, secure, occupy. He said the enemy was minor, insurgents, raiders, local deviation names meant to imply that fear was wasteful. I cupped my hands around my rebreather valve anyway, as if the habit could protect me from words. The deck vibrated with a rhythm I'd come to know better than sleep. We were stacked in our straps like bones in a long metal ribcage, 100 bodies corseted in harness webbing, las rifles slack across our chests, boots braced against the transport's skin. The air smelled of solvent and tallow, blessed oil and anxious sweat. The hard, clean odor of new uniforms weighed down by borrowed histories. Across from me, a boy who still had baby fat under the grime mouthed a prayer with no sound. Beside me, the man from the frozen mine moon tapped the edge of his rifle against his thigh, in time with the engine's heart. A sound like a second heartbeat, a metronome to march fear into order. The drill masters had taught us to trust rhythm more than thought. Thought could be punished. Rhythm could be praised. We had crossed the between space to reach this place. The days in the dark stretched, folded, and sewn back together by men who believed that mathematics could domesticate the abyss. We did not see that crossing. We endured it. The cabin lights had flickered in planned intervals as if the machine itself blinked, and the chaplain's voice had filled the gaps, a braided rope of scripture and threat. The Emperor's will is a straight line, he told us as we drifted in our straps. The void is its shadow. You will be the line. I imagined then the line like a knife being drawn across my throat. There was comfort in the image's honesty. The alarm chimed. 3 tones, descending. The straps bit. The floor came up with a lurch. Gravity returned like a reprimand. The boy across from me swallowed his prayer. We checked our magazines in the same beat, click, check, click, and intoned the litany we'd been given to domesticate the weapon's spirit. Awake, be true, burn straight. I felt the fuse of dread and readiness catch in my chest and glow. I was a tool. Tools don't decide, they function. The ramp dropped. What I remember first of that safer world was the light. It wasn't the perpetual wound red of my birth sky, nor the thin blue of training camp fluorescence, but a pale, almost yellow light that made every surface look soft. It lay over a plain of wet soil and low scrub, and it reflected from a river that moved slowly like a vein. The air smelled of wet iron and crushed grass. Someone behind me cried the kind of involuntary sound a body makes when it sees something it never thought it would again. Not joy. Shock. We tasted the air and coughed at nothing but its lack of poison, like exiles flinching at kindness. Then the second impression, the sound of order unpacking itself. Voxes barking, servitors lowering prefabricated teeth into the earth stakes, towers, gun shields, officers pointing with batons carved from someone else's obedience. The planet went from quiet to occupied in the span of a few hundred heartbeats. I remember thinking, the ground doesn't have to hate us to be ruined by us. It only has to be here. They marched us off the transports and into ranks that already existed for us, chalk lines waiting like grooves in a machine. Our regiment's number had been painted on the side of the supply carrier in utilitarian script, the digits stark as a sentence. The commanding officer, a woman with a face that looked carved, not born, outlined the operation. Small settlements along the river had gone to error. The inhabitants had lapsed. There were reports of non-compliant fauna. She said these words without venom, as if describing weather. Remember your catechisms, she finished, eyes passing over us without stopping. Remember your breath. Remember that mercy belongs to the Emperor. Your task is justice. Justice wore the same boots as inevitability. We moved out. My first step into the field was a betrayal. My boot sank into mud that did not sting. It parted around the leather like a mouth without teeth. The grass brushed my knee and didn't flay it. There were insects that weren't knives. I wanted to lie down in it and breathe until I drowned. We marched instead, our column a black thread stitching fresh geometry into living cloth. The first village was a smear of low huts and bleached palings. The doors gaped. Wind moved through the interiors like a cautious beast. Cooks's fires had gone to ash that lacked the razor grit. I knew ash that lifted in soft sighs when we walked through it. In one hut, a table was still set. Tin plates, a small spoon, a cup turned on its side with a thumbprint in dried stew. I could see the ridges that marked that thumb. It was indecent, like finding a stranger's folded skin. Clear, announced the point squad's vox. No movement, no heat. But there were marks the auspex could not reckon. The smell of fear. A sweetness that had no business inside wood. Scratches on beams chest high, too even for claws. The boy who had preyed on the transport reached toward the marks with his gloved hand. Sir? What made? Not your question, said the corporal softly, and put the boy's hand down. We found the first bodies just beyond the village. They had been arranged. That's how it felt. Arranged. 6 of them knelt at the edge of the riverbank, heads bowed as if listening to water. Their hands were clasped together with cord worked. Braided cord, not the makeshift binding of panic. Their throats had been cut with something blunt. Not to the bone, the knife had respected the structure, as if the murderer believed sacrament required neatness. Flies worked the edges with crisp professionalism. The chaplain made the sign over them and declared them reclaimed by duty. The commissar, who had walked among us silent and watchful until then, gave us our first real order. Purge what remains. The incendiaries bloomed. The smell came up hot and sweet. I thought of the burn pyres of my habs, of bodies steaming on scrap, of smoke matter-of-factly returning to the sky the flesh it had leased. I felt the same small, tight thing in my throat. Not grief, not horror. Recognition. Flame is one of the galaxy's fluent tongues. It says the same words everywhere. We dug in on a small rise. The soil was plush, too eager to take our trench spades, and the earthworms we cut in half twitched in disappointment. Our hands shaped the parapet with rote competence. Sandbags came down the line in a measured thud, 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 another drum to draw us into an old dance. Barbed wire sang as we stretched it. Machine emplacements blossomed like unpleasant flowers. Men swore at stakes and kissed weapon sights. Night came on quickly, as if someone had forgotten to wind the day. Dark made the new world revert to a language I understood. The first attack was not announced. There was no horn, no drum, no respectful interval. There was only absence, the sudden stopping of night sounds. The river's whisper dulled, the insect's chorus cut at the root. The wind decided it had other appointments. The silence became a pressure on the eardrums, then a temperature, then a shape. The flares went up with a scream that scratched at the inside of my teeth. For a fraction, the whole world was a slow painting, the wire glittering white, the river a slick ribbon of mercury, the fields tipped with frost we didn't notice until they shone. And in that white movement, not a charge, a folding, as if the night itself had creased and what lived in the crease unrolled. "Contact," said the Vox in its helpful voice, as if reading out the time. "Contact, contact." The first figure hit the wire wrong, and its long limbs tangled, and for a moment it thrashed like a thing unsure it had chosen a correct body. The second came low, mouse silent, the kind of silence born of learning how to please someone who punishes. The third was tall. It had the wrong number of joints. I don't know if they were men. I don't know if the word matters. They wore scraps and veils, nothing uniform, and their faces were painted with something that reflected light too eagerly. Some held blades that shimmered like wet bone. Some held stub guns that coughed like old lungs. One, I swear, simply brought its hands together and made a sound that pushed at my ribs from the inside. "Fire," said the corporal. Such a simple verb. Such a large consequence. Our rifles obeyed faster than we did. The trench burst into the red-white spitting that named us soldiers rather than meat. Las fire has a smell. We had been told that but had no context. Now I knew. Hot iron, the clean stink of blood being told to behave, the whisper of clothing agreeing to be not clothing anymore. The beams cut neat lines through the night and turned pieces of that night into steam. I fired because the men beside me fired. I sighted because my elbows had been drilled to find that position. I did not aim to kill. I aimed to not be seen disobeying. The first shape I hit made a high sound and discovered a new way to fold. It put its hands on the hole in itself as if it were trying to understand a math problem. It looked surprised. That, more than anything, converted me to the trench's doctrine. Surprise meant the enemy had expected to live. Expectation was treason. The beam took it again and corrected the error. The wire slowed them, but it did not stop them, and it taught us the boundary between fear and obedience. Fear wants to lift your head and look for a face to plead to. Obedience wants to make your spine into a rule. I kept my spine straight and my face down and my rifle working. The commissar moved behind us like a shadow that had been given a sidearm, murmuring the litany of proper posture and shot discipline. Men who tried to stand up to see were introduced to new, motivating reasons for posture. The enemy reached the ditch. Then the fight became individual, dirty, stupid, what all fights become when the clean lines run out. A thing with too many wrists fell into the trench in front of me and tried to put one of those wrists through my face. Its breath smelled like the rot behind a wall. I brought the rifle up and fired so close that scorched hair filled my mouth. It made that little surprise sound again and sat down in my lap as if we'd been lovers and it had grown tired. I had to push it away to let the man next to me fire past my ear. The man from the mine moon lost 2 fingers at some point and requested them back from the night. The night was unwilling to return them. He wrapped the stump in a strip of the prayer banner and apologized to the chaplain by reflex. Somewhere down the line, someone was singing. It took me a moment to understand it was the chaplain, because he had chosen a tune that sounded like wind slipping a knife into skin. "Hold the line," he sang, and in the next line he made it a sentence that could have been about breath, could have been about faith, could have been about digging your heels into wet soil and being a nail. Hold the line. We held it because the order was simpler than panic. Also because a commissar's pistol was lighter than the night, and it moved quicker than fear. It did not last long. Nothing that begins at that pitch does. They broke against our rule of angles and our dumb, cruel willingness. The second wave tripped on the corpses of the first. The third slipped on what leaked out of both. The fourth lost interest or nerve or orders. We kept firing until the Vox said the word that meant we could stop pretending we would fire forever. Then we waited, because movement after permission is disrespectful. The silence that returns to a battlefield is not silence. It is work. Dawn peeled the night off like a wet bandage and made us look. The field was a map of what happens to belief when it is asked to pay the tithe of physics. Bodies lay in untidy arguments with the wire. Steam rose. A piece of someone had gotten caught on a stake and fluttered the way cloth does in light wind. The river moved at the same speed as before. It did not care that we had changed. We went out under cover, slow and stupid with carefulness, and performed what the manual called post-engagement housekeeping. We shot things that had not learned yet that they were done. We reloaded, because the body loves ritual, and our bodies had found new rituals we could own. The boy who prayed prodded one of the enemy with his rifle barrel and said, "Sir, this one's teeth." And I looked and understood. They were filed into points and capped with metal. The cap work was neat, proud. It had taken time. Time is a kind of prayer. I wondered to whom. The commissar told the boy that curiosity was a hunger we could not feed in uniform. We tore down their icons where we found them in the houses. Symbols burned perfectly, meaning smells the same in every dialect when it cooks. In one hut, there was a shrine made of bread. Someone had shaped loaves into a shape that suggested a thing that lived in the water, and a thin slick had collected at the base, where offerings had bled into floorboards. We took photographs for the prosecution of memory. We burned that too. Midday. We chewed ration bricks with the slow, furred mouths of men who had sweated their taste buds raw. The bricks tasted like cardboard soaked in coin. The Medicae came down the line and poured clean sting into our cuts, and told our bodies to behave. The chaplain spoke over us in a voice soft enough that you could believe he remembered that throats become instruments without asking permission. He told us what we had done was good because it had been done, that the proof of righteousness is the persistence of the one who writes the report. That afternoon, they pushed us to the second village. We went without the flares. The second village had barricaded itself with furniture, a neat, domestic desperation. We peeled that back with sabotage and patience, because that is what is done to domestic things in time of holy work. Inside was a different arrangement of bodies. These wore uniforms that tried to look like ours without being ours, as if the enemy's god believed imitation could tempt power. Their insignia were handmade. One of them had stitched his rank wrong side up. I hated him for that detail more than for his breathing. The fight there was shorter and less honest. Corners magnify fear and make it malignant. Men die with less dignity when they die near the things they ate off of. We put them down because walls make obedience easier. There is less horizon to distract choice. Someone, no one we could see, kept speaking in a language that kept almost becoming ours and then swerving away in distaste. It said orders. Our orders answered. They were louder. Loudness has a moral component in war. That is the lie we need, so that we can reload. By dusk, the second village was ours in the way a wound becomes yours when the blade stops moving. We held it. We counted ourselves. We rehearsed the things we would say to the next officer who would speak our day into a ledger. We wrote names where we could not be punished for writing them. The inside of a helmet's brow pad, under the strap of a rifle sling, in spit on the boot heel that would be scuffed off by morning. We are animals that must put language somewhere. If denied paper, we will inscribe our existence on the faces of weapons, on skin, on mud. The mud of that world liked taking names. It swallowed them slowly, as if savoring. At night, the commissar read the list of infractions in a tone that implied love. No man is so loved as he who discovers how small he can make himself and still be pointed at a target. The chaplain asked for volunteers to confess to thinking. 4 men did, because they were clever. They were praised for their clarity and whipped for their initiative, which is how our gods keep the world round. Spin it with contradiction until the nausea becomes the only stable feeling, and then you will stand still to avoid vomiting. We slept in turns that did not satisfy any clock but the official one. In my hour I dreamed of my home's ash smell. Not the ash itself, but its taste. The rich, iron taste of a mouthful of dying that wasn't mine. I woke with the sense that I had bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to bleed, and that the taste was telling me truths I preferred not to know. The man from the mine moon was awake beside me, staring at the wood grain of the hut's ceiling as if he could learn a language from it. "Safer," he said at last, almost gently. "They said safer," I grunted. The word left a ring like a cup on a table. The next day was a patrol along the river. The banks were pocked with small holes that looked like mouths practicing vowels. Tracks that had too many ends led in and out of the water. We found a child's toy, a carved thing with the wrong number of legs caught in reeds. The corporal told us to move on and not inventory personal artifacts. The boy who prayed put the toy back in the reeds with careful hands. He said nothing. The reeds closed. That felt like an answer. The ambush from the far bank was clean. The first shot took the man behind me, where the skull meets the neck, and proved that breath can be convinced to leave by reasonable argument. We reacted with textbook precision and human sloppiness. I put 3 beams across a ripple where I thought a face might someday consider being. The river boiled in places where beams hit. Someone screamed, "Left," and meant everything. The enemy's fire was desultory, erratic. Ours was clipped and righteous. We had more batteries and better reasons. We crossed on orders we pretended were adrenaline and found the nests empty, the cheap brass warm, the rushes bruised by knees. They had gone into the water because of course the god in the bread had taught them where to run. We dragged the river with hooks. We found 2 bodies that had been comfortable with being bodies and one that had begun to fail the test. It had grown a second mouth where the first had grown bored. The commissar made a soft sound and shot it the professional amount of times. The chaplain told us, "You are not born guilty of what your enemy becomes." He sounded unconvinced. He sounded tired. That night, after we had reset the wire around our new nests and taught the mud our shape again, the chaplain came to our trench with a battered tin cup and a voice that had decided to be someone's father. He handed the cup to each man in turn. We drank something hot that tasted like priesthood trying to be kind. "You did well," he told us without smiling. "That's not the same as good, but well is what the emperor can use." I asked him then, because my mouth had grown reckless in the safety of routine pain, "What's the difference between fear and obedience?" I do not know why I asked. Perhaps the night had loosened the knots where the day ties us to our stations. He held the cup for a moment and looked out at the dark. "Fear wants to keep you alive," he said. "Obedience wants to keep you useful." "And you?" I asked. "What do you want?" He made the small priest's shrug, the one that keeps the back ready for lashes, and said, "For tomorrow to arrive on time." He moved on. He was a good man inside a machine that could not admit category beyond used and to be used. That is another kind of monster, the good man who has learned how to apply his goodness like oil to gears. We kept moving. That is what campaigns are. Movement narrated by numbers. Village to village, trench to trench, flanking march to flanking march. Some enemies wore faces we could follow with our eyes, some wore masks that argued with the light and made our brains ask for permission to interpret. Sometimes something screamed above us and left no shadow because it had forgotten how to make one. Sometimes, on still afternoons, we found gardens where vines had learned to climb in spirals too regular to be the work of wind. We shot those gardens out of respect for geometry. The regiment's paper trail said we advanced 12 kilometers in 4 days and reclaimed 16 souls for accounting. The numbers were clean and easy to polish. In the places the numbers named, the clay took an imprint of our boot treads and then filled them with a thin film of water that reflected a sky I did not trust. The water was the color of forgiveness. I stepped in it anyway. In our third week, we were told the campaign was going well enough that the officers had begun to sleep on cots rather than decisions. We were rewarded with socks. We received a lecture on the proper reverence due to socks. The commissar argued that dry feet are grateful feet, and grateful feet make obedient spines. He lied with his whole handsome face. We loved him for the effort. The enemy struck that night with the quiet inventiveness of men who have learned they must deserve killing. They came up through the river like memory. They moved through our wire in a way that suggested old partnership. They crawled into our trench with the intimacy of regret. It was less a fight than a lesson in maintenance. Your work must be redone. Your lines must be redrawn. Your fear must be re-educated daily. We did what we had been taught. We made the night red in careful lines. We shouted the right short words and kept the wrong long words for later. When it ended, we were the ones still in the trench, because we had expected to be. Afterward, as the medicae stitched and counted, I sat with my back against the parapet and looked at my hands. They were cracked, oiled, obedient. Blood, mine and not mine, had dried into the lines. I licked a thumb without thinking and tasted copper and old smoke and that particular tang that lives where electricity and flesh negotiate. It tasted like home. I do not mean the huts and stilts. I mean the fact that the world wants you, not to live, but to choose again. To choose to put your body where someone else tells you it belongs. I understood then what the training camp song had not meant to teach. Orders and prayers are the same shape in the mouth. The difference is the direction of the breath after. In a prayer, you exhale and ask to be heard. In an order, you inhale and accept that you will not be. Either way, your chest rises and falls. Either way, your ribs count you down. We were told the planet was safer than ours. Perhaps it was. It killed us politely. It offered us soft earth to fall into. It provided water to wash the blood from our hands. It did not scream when we cut it. It did not rearrange itself to swallow our houses. It only insisted that there were people on it who were wrong. The Imperium excels at curing that illness. Weeks later, when we were rotated to the rear for 72 minutes, that someone else's ledger called rest. I stood beside the river and watched the current carry past me the husks of insects, the petals of a shrub, a fragment of cloth. The cloth snagged on a reed, and for a time the water pulled it and the reed held it, and that was a conversation that did not require a chaplain. I thought of the boy who had prayed on the transport. He had stopped praying aloud. He had learned that some gods punish noise. He now moved like a knife, surprised to find it has a handle. We were recalled to line by a horn made of metal and vowels. We went, because that is what our bodies did now, when the air arranged itself into certain shapes. On the way, I stepped in mud, and the mud embraced me with an old affection. It smelled of iron and rain, and what must rot before anything else can grow. I thought of the soil of my birth, and the way it hissed and smoked, and I wanted to laugh at the tender cruelty of memory. You can escape a world. You cannot escape the way it taught your body to define comfort. People imagine baptism as a gentle towel and water that recognizes your name. Our baptism came hot from capacitors and burned lines into the night. It left marks we were not asked to show. It told us, you belong to those who give you targets. It taught us, the first law is that your breath is a tithe. On that safer world, the blood that soaked the mud smelled almost sweet, and yes, almost comforting, the way a scar itches in good weather, the way an old wound hums when the storm is near. I stood ankle deep in that mud and breathed, and did not feel like an intruder. I felt correct. Not right, not good, correct. As if the universe were a machine, and I had finally been slotted into the groove that fit the broken cog I had become. The chaplain would have called that peace. I know better. It was only alignment. Alignment is how you survive long enough to die where someone needs you to fall. That night, the commissar read to us a casualty list that sounded like a song whose words were lost, but whose melody you could hum. He said the names with the same care the enemy had taken, filing their teeth. He dismissed us with a nod that implied there would be another list. He was right. Being right is one of the smaller sins in war. When I sleep now, and the training camp sirens no longer colonize my dreams, it is that first village I visit, the table laid for a meal that never happened, the child's thumbprint dried in a smear of stew, the river making unhurried work of the shore. I stand in that doorway and feel the old shame of someone who has broken into a home and found no one there to forgive him. I stand while the flares scream and make the world white and sharp, and I raise my rifle because that is what my hands know, and I am baptized again with light and heat, and the thin voice in my ear that says fire, and the world obeys, and so do I. It is not faith, it is not courage. It is something smaller and larger, like the sound a trigger makes when you decide to become an instrument. They were right. The enemy could have been anything: raider, heretic, beast in a shape that had borrowed our walk. It mattered less than the measure of our obedience. And in that measure we passed, because we had been trained to. Because the body that learned to sleep with poison in its lungs now learned to sleep with the smell of blood in its nose and to wake eager to make more. Because orders and prayers taste the same after a while, and your tongue only cares that it is allowed to move. We left that world months later in a different direction than we arrived. Our boots carried clots of its soil into the hold. The transport smelled of river mud and antiseptic truth. The officers' reports declared the operation concluded, the vector purified, the population managed into compliance with the larger rhythm. The chaplain blessed our return with the same tired voice. The commissar counted us like coins. The engines folded the space around our hubris. The boy who prayed leaned his head back against the bulkhead and closed his eyes and did not move his mouth. He had found a quieter chapel, the inside of his skull. I sat in my strap and felt the deck thrum, and thought about the first thing I had killed that had looked back at me. Not the beast that had fallen into my lap that was only reflex. I mean the person wearing a mask with painted eyes, who had flinched when my beam took his shoulder and had reached for the wound not to stop the blood, but to check its temperature, as if he had expected it to be colder than human blood, and was disappointed. I dream of his disappointment more than of his death. In the dream, he looks up at me as if he knows me from somewhere and cannot place the memory. I wake, with my tongue tasting ash. I have not breathed in years. The transport's lights dimmed to suggest the mercy of night. Men muttered in their sleep or had the good manners to be quiet. Somewhere farther up the spine, an engine made a coughing sound and then found its virtue again. The ship is a cathedral to repetition. I learned to pray in its pews, not to any they taught me, but to a principle let me continue doing, because doing is easier than deciding. Let me be told again, and spared the choice. When the lights brightened to suggest morning, we were given new orders, and the chaplain said the words again, and the commissar's pistol lay like punctuation across his knee, and I felt the smallest smile crack the skin at the corner of my mouth. Not joy, not pride. The muscle memory of someone who knows the next step to the dance and is almost grateful. On that safer world, I had learned the difference at last. Fear is what you feel when you want to live. Obedience is what you perform when the wanting is less important than the counting. Orders and prayers, yes, two sides of the same coin rubbed thin by the same fingers. And the blood in the mud, how honest it was. How its iron smell braided with damp earth into a cord I recognized from a place with stilts and smoke and a sky that never forgave. To be born on a death world is to breathe poison and call it air. To be sent to a safer world is to breathe orders and call it purpose. I am not sure which suffocates slower. I only know that the lungs don't care what fills them, as long as there is something to push out again, until there isn't. Excellent. Now begins ***. Chapter 7, ***, the last memory of home. The moment when years of war begin to blur, and memory itself becomes the only refuge left. The narrator, hardened and hollowed, looks backward for the first time in decades, toward the place that forged him. The tone is slower, now haunted, meditative, eroded by exhaustion. ***, Chapter 7, the last memory of home. ***. War has a sound. It isn't the noise of weapons or engines or screaming. It's quieter, like a constant whisper at the back of the skull, the sound of purpose grinding against conscience. It never stops, even when the fighting does. Especially then. Years have passed since my baptism. That's the word they used, times baptism by lasfire, times as if killing was a sacrament, as if being burned clean by light made you pure. It didn't. It only changed the color of the scars. We fought on 100 worlds. At least, that's what the campaign records said. In truth, it all blurred into one long, feverish season of mud and sky and smoke. Every planet had a different name, but they all smelled the same: ozone, blood, and the faint tang of human decay. I stopped learning the names after the 5th. They were just coordinates where we were told to die efficiently. At first, I counted the worlds. Then I counted the dead. Eventually, I stopped counting altogether. Somewhere between deployments, the color drained out of the stars. That's how I knew I'd served long enough. The uniform changed. The emblem on my shoulder changed. The officers changed. But the prayers never did. They were the same empty shapes whispered into the air before dawn, when the chaplains made us kneel in the dirt and thank the Emperor for another day of endurance. By pain, we serve, we said. By death, we are sanctified. I used to mouth the words. Now I just moved my lips. No one noticed. No one ever does. The Imperium doesn't care what your mouth says, only that your hands keep working. The last campaign before they broke me was on a desert moon orbiting a dying Sunday. The heat was unbearable. The air shimmered like liquid glass. We fought insurgents there, or heretics, or maybe just men who wanted to keep the little they had. It didn't matter. The briefing told us everything we needed to know. Asterisk. They are not you. Asterisk. That's always the first step to killing, reminding yourself that what you're killing isn't the same kind of breathing thing you are. I remember crouching behind a ridge of glassy rock, lasgun propped against my knee, sweat stinging my eyes. The sand was black here, magnetic, humming faintly with energy. It stuck to our boots and our skin, clinging like guilt. The sergeant barked orders through the vox, his voice cracked by static. Advance in pairs. Purge the holdouts. No waste of munitions. We moved as told. The air shimmered with heat distortion. I could see movement in the ruins ahead, shapes darting between the broken walls. When the first shot came, it was bright and clean. It hit the man beside me in the throat, and he folded without sound. I didn't even blink. We returned fire, methodical, efficient. Every shot a small ritual. The beams sliced through the haze, burning silhouettes into the air. When the fighting ended, the only sound left was the wind dragging glass across glass. The others began to move forward to clear the bodies. I stayed back, kneeling beside the man who'd fallen beside me. He was young, younger than I'd ever been. His eyes were open, staring upward. There was something in them, something I hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not faith, just time's wonder. Asterisk. He looked as though he'd seen something beautiful in the final instant. I envied him for that. The sergeant shouted for me to move. I stood, but my body felt wrong, too heavy, as if the gravity had increased. My boots sank into the black sand, and when I pulled them free, they made a sound like a whisper. Asterisk home. Asterisk. That night, I dreamed of the red jungles. I dreamed of the air that burned to breathe. I dreamed of my mother's voice, soft beneath the roar of the storms. By breath, we endure. When I woke, I was crying. Not the loud kind, just quiet tears that made little tracks through the dust on my face. I didn't wipe them away. The others were too busy cleaning their weapons to notice. The next day, we moved on to another ruin. Another firefight. Another set of bodies. The sun above us swelled until it filled half the sky, bleeding light across the horizon. Everything shimmered, melted, blurred. I began to think I could see my homeworld reflected in it, its broken stilts, its trembling ground, its endless hunger. When the command came to burn the dead, I volunteered to light the pyres. The sergeant nodded, not out of trust but relief. No one wanted the smoke in their lungs. I didn't care. I'd been breathing worse my whole life. As the fire rose, I stood close enough for the heat to bite. The smell hit me like a memory. The burning of metal, the hiss of chemicals, the faint sweetness of roasted flesh. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I wasn't on this world at all. I was back on the stilts, watching the pyres below, the elders whispering prayers that no one believed. Home. The word felt poisonous and sacred all at once. Later, when the company bivouacked for the night, I sat apart from the others, staring at the stars. They were faint here, washed out by the sun's dying glow. But one of them, small, red, flickering like a wound, caught my attention. I wondered if it was mine. My world. The one that had birthed me, cursed me, hardened me. I tried to imagine what it looked like now. Maybe the stilts had fallen completely. Maybe the beasts had reclaimed everything. Maybe the wind still carried prayers to an emperor who had never answered. And then, something I hadn't felt in years. Longing. Not for safety, not for comfort, just for truth. My home had been cruel, but honest. It never promised anything but pain. The Imperium, though it wrapped its cruelty in banners and hymns, it taught us to love our torment, to polish our chains until they gleamed like medals. On my world, we fought the air itself. Here, we fought men who looked like us, prayed like us, and died the same way. And we called it holy. I began to dream more after that. Dangerous dreams. Dreams where the poison air filled my lungs again, and I laughed because it hurt. Dreams where the beasts sang beneath the soil, their voices deep and familiar. Dreams where my mother stood before me, her face hidden by the rebreather hood, whispering, "You left us, but you never left." One night, during a lull between campaigns, the commissar caught me awake after lights out. He asked why I wasn't sleeping. I told him the truth. I dream of home. He studied me for a long time, eyes pale in the glow of his data slate. "That's not uncommon," he said finally. "Many soldiers do. It means your will is strong enough to remember your origin." I almost laughed. "No," I said. "It means I wish I'd died there." He didn't smile. He didn't threaten me. He just nodded once, almost respectfully. Then he said, "Be careful what you wish for, guardsman. The Emperor hears everything, especially the things he chooses to ignore." After that, he transferred me to a forward-line company, a polite execution. We landed on a jungle moon this time, green, wet, the air thick enough to chew. It should have felt alien. It didn't. The smell of rot, the hiss of unseen creatures in the dark, it was almost comforting. The others cursed the heat. I breathed it in like prayer. When the first ambush came, I didn't flinch. When the blood hit my face, I smiled. The mud smelled like home. We fought for days without sleep. The jungle swallowed men whole. The trees bled sap that corroded armor. Every step was a negotiation with something hungry, and in that hunger, I felt peace. I understood it. It was honest again. At night, when the fighting stopped, I would stand watch and listen to the sounds around me, the low calls of beasts, the rustle of leaves, the hiss of rain on metal. I began to whisper to the darkness, not prayers. Conversations. "You're still here," I'd say. "Still watching. Still feeding." I think the jungle listened. Sometimes the ground would tremble softly beneath my boots, and I could almost hear a heartbeat, slow, massive, patient. I'd close my eyes and imagine it was my world breathing again, calling to me through the roots. By the end of the campaign, half our company was gone. The officers called it acceptable attrition. The chaplain called it sanctified loss. I called it familiar. When the order came to withdraw, I was disappointed. I didn't want to leave. The jungle had already claimed me. The Imperium just hadn't realized it yet. Now, as I write this in the dim red light of the transport hold, I can feel the soil of that place still under my nails. I can smell it on my skin. The others are sleeping, their breaths slow, and even in the recycled air. I envy them. I haven't slept in days. I'm afraid that if I close my eyes, I'll wake up somewhere true. Somewhere the air burns again and the ground trembles to my name. Maybe that's what I want. Because out here, serving the Emperor, the cruelty is endless but impersonal. You die as a statistic, not a story. Back home, Every death was intimate. The world knew you. The air carried your name. The soil remembered your bones. Even the beasts sang for you. When I think of that now, I feel something close to love. Not for the people I lost, not for the faith that failed us, but for the world itself, the one that tried to kill me and failed, the one that shaped me into something even the Imperium couldn't unmake. I miss it. I miss the poison in my lungs, the ash on my tongue, the storms that scoured everything clean. I miss knowing that every breath was stolen, that survival was defiance. I miss the honesty of pain. Maybe that's what home really is. The place that teaches you how to die properly. The commissar said once that the Emperor hears everything. If that's true, then he's hearing me now. And I hope he understands the words I've never dared to pray aloud. Asterisk. I was never yours. Asterisk. Asterisk. I was the world's before you found me. Asterisk. Asterisk. And someday, when this armor cracks and this body fails, I'll go back to her, to the soil, to the beasts, to the poison. Asterisk. Asterisk. She'll remember me. Asterisk. Asterisk. She always does. Asterisk. They say the Emperor watches. If he does, then he has seen everything that has ever crawled, burned, or begged its way through his galaxy, and still he says nothing. That silence is his truest miracle. To witness this endless theater of ruin and never once flinch. I am writing this on a field that isn't a field anymore. Once it was green, now it is glass. Once it sang with life, now it hums with radiation. The sun above us is foreign and feverish, swollen like a dying heart. The ground trembles occasionally, not from the world's hunger, but from the steady cadence of artillery somewhere far beyond the horizon. The war has moved past us, but its shadow lingers. It always does. I've been shot. Not badly enough to die quickly, not cleanly enough to live. The lasbolt punched through the flank of my armor and kissed the lung beneath. Now each breath rattles, wet and heavy, like dragging a shovel through mud. The Medicae gave me a coagulant and left me with the others who won't see another dawn. They moved on, as duty demands. No one stays behind for the dying. That's not cruelty, it's efficiency. The efficiency of an empire that has run out of mercy. So I lie here in the hollow of a crater, surrounded by the bodies of men I knew only by number. The sky flickers with the echo of orbital fire, beautiful, in its way, like lightning learning discipline. The air smells of glass and blood and the faint sweetness of vaporized flesh. I watch the light crawl across the smoke and try to decide if this is what peace looks like. I think of my first breath, the taste of poison, the ash in the air, the tremble of the ground under the stilts of Habstilt 9. I remember my mother's voice whispering through her cracked mask. By breath we endure, by pain we prove, by survival we serve. She said it like a spell, like something that could trick the world into letting us see another dawn. She was wrong, of course. The world doesn't bargain. It just waits. I survived her. I survived the beasts. I survived the Emperor's men. And now, lying here with half a lung and a pocket full of ration crumbs, I wonder why. What was all that endurance for? To end here, nameless again, waiting for the sky to bury me? The vox in my helmet crackles, sometimes snatches of command, fragments of scripture, by faith, by fire, by flesh. Then static. Always static. It sounds almost like breathing. I listen to it the way I used to listen to the storms back home, waiting to hear the world call my name again. When I close my eyes, I can see my home world, not as it was, but as it always wanted to be free of us. The stilts are gone, the metal has sunk into the soil, the beasts crawl across the surface without fear. The air dances with poison clouds that catch the light like auroras. It's beautiful in its cruelty. Honest, the way the Imperium never was. I think of the officers, the chaplains, the commissars, all those who taught us that pain was proof of devotion. They were wrong too. Pain proves nothing. It only measures how much the flesh can remember before it forgets itself. I can still taste the blood in my mouth. Metallic, warm, almost familiar. The wind moves through the broken trench beside me, carrying with it the faint hiss of burning insulation. It sounds like a voice. I know it's just the air, but I let myself believe it's her, the planet that birthed me, calling me home across the void. "You've done enough," it seems to whisper. "Come back. I want to. Emperor, forgive me, I want to." But there's that word again. Emperor. Forgive? He never forgave anything. He doesn't need to. He doesn't even speak. His silence is the truest commandment. Obey. Endure. Die. Repeat. That is his creed, etched into the bones of every world that dares to breathe beneath his empire. The stars overhead are fading. The red one, the one I used to imagine was mine, burns dimmer now. Maybe it's dying. Maybe it's already dead, and I'm just seeing its ghost. That seems fitting. Everything in the Imperium is a ghost: faith, duty, humanity, echoes of things that once meant something. I cough, and the pain folds me in half. Blood spills from between my teeth, bright in the low light. It smells like home. For a moment, I can almost taste the ash again, the tang of corrosion, the bitter gift of a world that never lied to me. I breathe it in, slow and shallow, pretending the air is poison once more. It feels right. The wind shifts, carrying with it the faint scent of ozone, the signature of Lasfire, distant and disciplined. The war is still happening out there. It will always be happening. The Imperium doesn't end wars. It feeds on them. Somewhere, men are still shouting hymns into the smoke. Somewhere, another child is being born into a world that wants him dead. Somewhere, another mother is whispering the same useless prayer through a broken mask. And the Emperor is listening, and saying nothing. I used to wonder if silence was cruelty. Now I think it's something worse. Indifference. I roll onto my back, the movement sharp and final. The stars spin above me, blurring together. I remember their names from the campaign maps, all those coordinates we fought for, bled for, forgot. But the only one that matters is the small red one flickering like a dying ember. I reach up toward it, though my arm doesn't quite obey. My fingers tremble, blackened with soot and blood. It feels like I'm touching something infinite and already lost. "I'm coming home," I whisper. The vox crackles, catching the sound and twisting it into static. For a heartbeat, I swear I hear another voice answer. Not words, just breath. The pain is gone now. The fear went first, then the anger, then the weight of all those names and numbers. What's left is quiet, not the silence of obedience, not the silence of discipline, but the silence of the end. A silence that belongs to no god. As the darkness folds over me, I see her again, my world, the death world, the mother that tried to kill me and failed. She looms in the void like a smoldering wound, her clouds of ash curling like hands. I can almost feel her touch on my face, rough and hot, the way a storm touches everything without asking. By breath, we endure. I whisper one last time. The words rattle in my throat, then fade into the wind. My breath catches, then stops, and for the first time in my life, there is no pain, no noise, no orders, no prayers, just the Emperor's silence, and beneath it, something older, something deeper, the heartbeat of a world that remembers me,